Hey Spuds, it's Jamie. Welcome back to another video. First one on the channel, I don't know, but welcome either way. I'm very glad to have you here. And today we are talking all about sports, transphobia, and misogyny, amongst a few other things. Are you ready? One of the biggest stories coming out of the Paris Olympics at the moment is around the women's boxing and the general conversation around inclusivity in sport. The controversy is all about two of the women's boxing divisions. One of the boxers in the 66 kilogram category is Algerian boxer Imane Khelif, who has received particularly harsh criticism after a recent win. Imane won her round of 16 match when her Italian opponent abandoned the match after 46 seconds. Afterwards, her opponent refused to shake hands with Khelif and began crying. Things started to heat up pretty quickly on social media afterwards, with a lot of trending discussions on the topic, because some quite influential people were under the impression that Imane is a trans woman, which led to quite the number of transphobic and presumptive tweets going around. Now, why would people think Imane Khelif was trans in the first place? Well, to try and understand that, we need to go back to 2016. A body called the IBA, the International Boxing Association, ran the Olympic boxing tournament in Rio in 2016. The IBA have had a lot of controversy themselves. In 2019, they were suspended and did not run the Olympic boxing tournament in the Tokyo 2020 Games. And last year, in 2023, they were permanently banned from the Olympics altogether. And the future of having boxing in the Olympics beyond the Paris Games is uncertain unless a new body is found to take their place. So, what is this IBA controversy about? In a word, Russia. The IBA has had decades of troubled governance and lack of transparency. In 2019, they elected a president with deep ties to Russian organized crime, and the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, suspended them. Since then, the IBA have elected a new president, Kremlin, who is an acquaintance of Putin, which only made things worse because then much of the IBA operation was moved to Russia in 2020. Kremlin signed a significant sponsorship deal with Russia's state energy supplier, which was known to essentially fund the entire IBA operation. But in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the International Olympic Committee wanted them to drop the Russian energy supplier's sponsorship and make other reforms to its governance and finance to resolve ethical issues. In 2023, the Olympic Committee were not satisfied with the IBA's response, including claims that the sponsorship had apparently expired in 2022. Spoiler, they claimed on the 5th of August this year, the day I was planning this video, that they are still sponsored by them. And thus, the Olympic Committee stripped their sanction of the IBA. The IBA appealed the decision in the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and in April, it was turned down for multiple reasons, including the IBA's continuing lack of financial transparency, continuous issues with referees and judges, and failure to implement what the International Olympic Committee had asked for. Now, just because they were banned by the Olympics for issues with corruption and transparency does not mean that they were banned everywhere. In 2023, they still ran the International Boxing Championships, where Imane Khelif was due to compete. Imane had been able to compete in IBA-run events for years with no issues, including the International Championships the year before in 2022, where she had won a silver medal, also governed by the IBA. They didn't seem to have a problem with her then. But then at the 2023 International World Championships, Imane beat a previously unbeaten Russian boxer. And after this match, it was announced by the IBA, who, let's remember, have deep ties to Russia and whose president is Russian, and are specifically condemned and banned from the Olympics for transparency issues, then announced that Imane had failed gender eligibility tests, providing very little detail and disqualifying Imane from the competition, meaning the Russian boxer's record was now perfect again and she remained unbeaten. They also disqualified Lin Yu-ting, a boxer from Taiwan, under the same justification, that she had failed gender eligibility tests. So what are these gender tests that the IBA are referring to? At the time of planning and filming this, the IBA have refused to state what specific tests were carried out and what the results mean. A statement issued recently by the IBA is that Imane Khelif and Lin Yu-ting did not undergo testosterone tests. Instead, it was stated that they failed a separate and recognized test whereby the specifics remain confidential. The decision to disqualify these two boxers was also carried out by two IBA members and not reviewed. So we actually don't know what these tests supposedly are, but what we do know is that Imane and Lin have been competing for years, including at the Olympics 3 years ago in Tokyo, and they haven't exactly been dominating the competition. Imane lost in the quarterfinals in Tokyo, and Lin lost in the round of 16, and they were being passed to compete without any issues preventing them from boxing back then, until this sudden 2023 test that nobody can really explain. A 2023 story in Taiwan, when Lin Yu-ting was disqualified, said no explanation was given other than an abnormality, despite the fact that she'd never failed a gender eligibility test before. Both boxers' documents and sources close to them, Imane's father and the Chinese Taipei Olympic Committee for Lin, have confirmed them as being cis women, and for all intents and purposes, this is what we know. But of course, the issue is to do with gender and potential trans people, so social media went bananas. J.K. Rowling chimed in comedian Khelif, and this is what she had to say. Could any picture sum up our new men's rights movement better? The smirk of a male who knows he's protected by a misogynistic sporting establishment enjoying the distress of a woman he's just punched in the head and whose life's ambition he's just shattered. Logan Paul has even decided to weigh in on the situation. This is the purest form of evil unfolding right before your eyes. A man was allowed to beat up a woman on a global stage, crushing her life dream while fighting for her deceased father. This delusion must end. An account called End Wokeness added, an absolute travesty at the Olympics. Angela Carini is forced to box against a biological male. She quits after just 45 seconds and cries hysterically as her opponent is declared the winner. Don't look away. This is wokeness. Sharon Davies tweeted a video clip of the match and stated, I'm so angry at the IOC. They learn nothing from history or science and women continually pay the price. Marjorie Taylor Greene called Imane a real man, fraud, imposter, and a liar. Quite the statements to tweet before knowing the true facts of the situation. A real woman, Angela Carini, who trained for years to box at the Olympics, is defeated by a real man pretending to be a woman. He is a fraud, an imposter, and a liar. Shame on everyone who allows men to compete against women. Democrats support this. J.D. Vance blamed Kamala Harris's idea about gender on what's happened. This is where Kamala Harris's ideas about gender lead, to a grown man pummeling a woman in a boxing match. This is disgusting and all of our leaders should condemn it. Liz Truss, the shortest serving British Prime Minister who famously could not outlast a lettuce, didn't just go for Imane and for sport, but was also just generally outright transphobic. When will this madness stop? Men cannot become women. Why is the British government not objecting to this? And Elon Musk replied absolutely from this tweet from Riley Gaines. Men don't belong in women's sports. Hashtag I stand with Angela Carini. Let's get it trending. And many other people weighed in on the situation before having the full amount of information, making equally as ridiculous assumptions and being equally as horrifically transphobic and just horrible to these individual boxers as well. Now, you may be confused and have some questions, including, are Imane Khelif and Lin Yu-ting trans? The reality is the people tweeting these things didn't know either. They were jumping to a conclusion based on little to no reason, with no justified evidence, and demonstrating high levels of transphobia as they did this. This is significantly more important to take from the story of events rather than the actual answer to the question. Because what this means is that any woman, cis or trans, are being treated unfairly and ostracized because of transphobia. And not just transphobia, but a huge pile-on of misogyny and bullying by highly influential people and supposedly impartial news platforms, leading to even more bullying and unsubstantiated damage by general society. Many people have now gone on a witch hunt with supposedly no care for the consequences for Imane and Lin or those close to them. And it wasn't long before mainstream media platforms took the social media assumptions and ran with them, with some outlets creating multiple stories on the matter, referring to Imane Khelif in all kinds of ways. Here we have one that frames the controversy by stating that Imane failed a gender test in the title. Paris Olympics controversy. Italian boxer Angela Carini quits bout in 46 seconds against Algerian pugilist Imane Khelif, and they spelled her name wrong, who failed gender test. The article describes Imane's journey of championship medal wins and then her disqualification in 2023. The report shared multiple transphobic and assumptive tweets and emphasized the emotional reaction from Imane's opponent. Fox News ran with referring to Imane as a boxer with male chromosomes, saying she left her opponent in tears after hard hits. Olympic boxer deemed to have male chromosomes wins fight in 46 seconds, opponent left in tears after hard hits. The article again describes a lot about Imane's opponent, how she quit after one hit and had stated the match wasn't fair. The Daily Mail, unsurprisingly, went hard in, publishing multiple articles in just a matter of days. They went for headlines including, Italian boxer Angela Carini says, I quit to save my life after stopping Olympics bout with biologically male opponent Imane Khelif just 46 seconds into first round. Is very inflammatory language from Imane's opponent, the professional trained Olympic boxer, fearing for her life, having her Olympic dream snatched away, being rocked by 2 punches, and that the blows had savage force. They also described Imane as being thrown out of last year's World Championships after failing a testosterone test, which is not what has been reported elsewhere. In fact, the specific test has not even been shared, and the information we do have suggests that it was nothing to do with testosterone. Female boxer yells this is unjust and falls to her knees in tears as she quits fight against biologically male Olympic opponent Imane Khelif after just 46 seconds following 2 powerful punches, was another article from the Daily Mail. And there was yet another one that had far more focus on the social media outcry after the match. That is also rooted in misogyny, despite many of the transphobic commenters calling themselves feminists, and saying they're speaking out to protect women. Olympian Sharon Davies rages that games chiefs are allowing women to be beaten up by men. Liz Truss asks when will this madness stop, and J.K. Rowling slams bullying cheat after biological male Imane Khelif wins 46-second games fight. Another article from a different publication was titled "Madness Rules the World, a transgender boxer crushed an Italian woman at the Paris Olympics." This was yet another article that led with statements from Imane's opponent, how she felt and her reactions, but included little to nothing about Imane aside from misreporting the gender eligibility test she supposedly failed. Within these articles, some of them said definitively that Imane Khelif has XY chromosomes, some said that she had high testosterone, called her transgender, and one claimed that just watching the fight was enough proof that she had high testosterone, because we all know that's a justifiable news source. These articles were all published incredibly quickly and clearly did no fact checking. They were all just stirring the pot, fear-mongering, and adding to the pile-on onto an athlete that had every right to compete, and further making her the target of a hate campaign. So what happened next for Imane? There are still those that are adamant that they weren't wrong and are upholding their transphobic and misogynistic viewpoints on the situation, despite it being clear that assumptions were made and conclusions were jumped to. These assumptions were not just made from unsubstantiated reports, but seemingly without care for who Imane Khelif is and how this could impact her. A lot was said immediately about the life and the journey of her opponent, but Imane was not offered the same respect. She was reduced to being nothing more than vague, unreviewed test results, and as a competitor who punched hard. Fortunately, there are now some more factually accurate articles coming out of the situation, and ones that break down the truth and the timeline, although so much damage has already been done. Imane Khelif is a 25-year-old Algerian boxer who gave up soccer as a teenager to pursue her passion in boxing. She made her first major tournament debut in 2018, before being one of Algeria's first 3 Olympic women's boxers to compete in Tokyo 2020. The initial reports made Imane out as an unstoppable and dangerous competitor. However, in reality, she's not known for being an unstoppable force or even a particularly hard hitter for her weight class, despite the fact that recent reports would have you believe that she is a danger to her opponents. She has respectable fighting skills and has competed in some international competitions and has won regional gold medals. However, her initial entry into elite level bouts saw her losing 5 out of 6, but she has improved and excelled since her debut. She's also a UNICEF national ambassador, but none of the original reports who were just running with transphobia and misogyny and the outcry on social media wanted you to know any of this about her. Imane and her family have now spoken out and have even had to release personal official documents to try and stop the hate going on against her. The Algerian Olympic Committee has spoken out in her defense and has ordered those calling Imane a man to delete their posts, and they have reserved the right to prosecute everyone who took part in spreading the misinformation about Imane. They've also submitted an official complaint to the IOC about the treatment of Imane Khelif. The Italian opponent who dropped out of the match against Imane Khelif that started all of this has now apologized, stating that her reaction was due to her Olympics being over and she would embrace Imane if they were to meet again. Despite this, Imane's next competitor, a Hungarian boxer, complained that she thought it was unfair that Imane was allowed to compete in the women's category. She'd initially stated that she didn't care what was being said about Imane on social media, saying if she or he is a man, it will be a bigger victory for her if she wins. She also shared this image on social media depicting a woman fighting a literal beast, and she's also shared multiple other posts with similar messaging, and things like this do a lot of damage. People truly are so disappointing. Spoiler though, Imane won that match and is now guaranteed to win an Olympic medal in boxing. The IOC has now spoken out in support of Imane Khelif and stated that this is not a transgender case. It is important to note, however, that if a transgender woman had been cleared to compete in the women's category by the International Olympic Committee, then I hope they would still come to the defense of that athlete. But we'll get more onto this in a bit. Individuals have now also spoken out in support of Imane Khelif, with American civil rights attorney Alejandro Carabello saying that the misinformation could endanger Imane's life because being gay or transgender is illegal in Algeria. And what about Lin Yu-ting? On Sunday, Lin Yu-ting won her match against her Bulgarian opponent, who after losing pulled off her gloves, pointed to herself and made a double tap X symbol with her fingers, presumably suggesting that she has XX chromosomes. But she did not answer any press questions and was notably upset. The Bulgarian coach was also seen holding up a handwritten piece of paper where he had written, "I only want to play with women, I am XX." He also stated, "I'm not a medical person, so I shouldn't say if Lin should or should not compete." Then maybe you shouldn't be saying anything at all. He carried on though, saying, "But when the tests show that he or she has a Y chromosome, home. She should not be here. Lin did do an interview after winning her match and spoke to Taiwanese media. She stated that she's received a lot of supportive messages, but hasn't read them because she's had to shut down her social media due to the barrage of abuse that she's been receiving. Since writing this script and literally as I've been making this video, the IBA held a press conference about the issue of both boxers, a press conference that's been deemed a shambles. So much so that there were huge technical difficulties. Kremlev's translator couldn't keep up with unexpected rants. Reuters cut the live stream of the press conference, and the BBC, who are not really known for being super trans friendly, even walked out before the end in protest. Kremlev at the conference stated that the Olympic bosses were trying to do everything to destroy feminine sport competitions, and that if the IBA were in charge, this would not have happened. Kremlev went on to criticize the portrayal of Christianity in the Olympic opening ceremony, which actually had nothing to do with Christianity, but instead was in reference to a painting of Greek gods. And also, by the way, nothing to do with the two boxers that the press conference was actually supposed to be about. Kremlev went on to say that he couldn't define what they had between their legs, but there are doctors who can check it, stating the boxers have very high levels of testosterone, but the IBA's doctor had said testosterone wasn't actually tested. I mean, this is not making any sense. The IOC already criticised the IBA's testing, saying that they only came near the end of the competition after the boxers had competed, which was completely arbitrary, that they weren't legitimate, nor were the processes or the ad hoc nature of them. Specifically stating the testing, the method of testing, the idea of the testing which happened kind of overnight, none of it is legitimate and this does not deserve any response. The same Olympic spokesperson also stated that he believed the two boxers had been targeted. There really is no conclusive evidence of the mentioned tests. But the reality is, right now, it doesn't even matter what the test results are. What this whole discourse demonstrates is that even without any evidence, this hateful transphobia, this desperation to hate trans people, doesn't just harm trans people, but also cis women, with unwarranted attacks being thrown on individuals who don't live up to some kind of ideal standard of what is expected of a woman. We'll get more into this in a moment, but first, even if Imane Khelif and Lin Yu-ting were trans women, why would this be such an issue? Would this witch hunt still have been unjustified? Spoiler, yes. Let's unpack this. Trans women in women's sports have been an issue for some people for a very long time, and right now people have become particularly incredibly, ridiculously loud about how much they disagree with trans women's inclusion. However, this loudness is all coming from a place of little to no knowledge about the actual situation, no knowledge of the criteria that is set, current frameworks around inclusion within sports, and most importantly, the scientific findings. Skylar Baylor, who was on the Harvard swim team, has some great information about this, and I'd recommend you go check out his Instagram for some further information. But there are three important things to note right now. 1. The International Olympic Committee has laid out framework for inclusion. 2. There are research results supporting the inclusion of trans women. And 3, there are things that actually do impact fairness and inclusion of women within sports. And surprisingly, it's not trans people. Firstly, let's have a chat about the framework from the International Olympic Committee. The IOC has laid out a framework for the inclusion and non-discrimination based on gender identity and sex variations at the Olympics. This framework basically says let's not blindly discriminate against people based on things like their gender identity, but instead let's take an evidence and scientific-based approach to make sports as fair and inclusive for all athletes. However, an issue with this framework is it's put the responsibility of inclusion and exclusion on individual sports federations to create their own policies for each sport. It's not necessarily a terrible thing, but unfortunately, some of these federations, including athletics and swimming, have developed policies that violate the meaning of the IOC's statement. The people crying out right now and attacking Imane Khelif and Lin Yu-ting because they think they're trans, and in turn attacking actual trans athletes, are doing so from a position of a biased political lens, which is shown by their readiness to pounce when they have insufficient evidence. There's often a pattern among people with transphobic views where they feel that they know better than the experts, better than doctors, better than scientists, better than sporting professionals. Basically, they think that they know better than everybody who doesn't also share their anti-trans worldview. A study published in April and funded by the IOC compared transgender and cisgender women athletes on metrics such as lung function, testosterone levels, and body composition. Results included showing similar concentration of testosterone and lower lung capacity. The authors spoke that results indicated that precautionary bans of transgender athletes in sports should not be recommended when sport-specific research research has not suggested otherwise. Basically, don't just ban trans women because they're trans women. A further report published in 2022 reviewed all scientific literature published between 2011 and 2021 about transgender women athletes. Key findings from this research include biomedical factors relating to puberty do not predict athletic performance. Social factors like nutrition, training, and access to equipment greatly impact an athlete's performance, but are consistently overlooked in policymaking. All people have estrogen and testosterone, and the distribution of testosterone in elite men athletes and elite women athletes overlaps. Only 3 studies have used trans athletes as subjects, and they indicate that any potential performance advantage is negated after testosterone suppression has been taken for 12 months. Findings also said that the majority of sports policies are not evidence-based and have participation requirements that are arbitrary. It was also found that trans women are significantly underrepresented in sport, especially at elite levels. This isn't to crap on trans athletes or their abilities at all, but it's an important point because if trans athletes had some huge advantage, surely we'd see them dominating sports achievements more than cis women. But this doesn't happen. The evidence directly counters the claim that a large number of trans women are competing in competitive sports. It also shows that social factors like coaching and access to training contribute far more than testosterone, which makes sense as an untrained cisgender man would not be able to beat an elite cisgender woman at her sport. By suggesting that trans women will dominate sports simply by the fact that they were assigned male at birth is not only untrue, but it completely disrespects the sporting abilities of cisgender women and the hard work that athletes put in. There are also many social factors that impact competitive differences between men's and women's sports. These include lack of women's teams, violence against women within sports, societal pressures on women's bodies and how they should look, including a lack of emphasis on particular types of strength training. None of these things are ever mentioned by the transphobes who say that trans women are the greatest threat. If they really cared about unfairness to women within sport, they would address the real issues like the ones I've just outlined. But no, they only use the guise of feminism when it provides the opportunity to be transphobic. To actually promote fairness for athletes within sport, we should acknowledge that biomedical research does not show a clear link between testosterone and athletic advantage, and that trans women do not have an inherent athletic advantage over cis women, and that 12 months of HRT and testosterone suppression is adequate. We should be rejecting misinformation and biased research. When making trans participation policies, research that asserts trans women as having an inherent advantage should not be used without basis. Yet this is what tends to happen, and how is that fair to anyone? And finally, we should be aiming to level the playing field for all athletes, and especially for women and girls in sport, with a focus on ending harassment, increasing access to equipment and training facilities, and pay equity. In short, if someone really cared about fairness for women within sport, they would not be wasting their time attacking trans women. There is currently no scientific consensus rooted in systematic, independent research that justifies the exclusion of trans athletes. Yet here we see that even the assumption that an athlete might be trans leads to a huge level of pushback and hate. And the majority of this pushback spreads misinformation that doesn't just harm Imane and Lin, but the trans community too. One such myth suggests that including trans women in women's sports will harm cis women. This is false. Excluding women who are trans hurts all women. It invites gender policing that could lead to any woman being invasively tested and or accused of being too masculine or too good at their sport to be a real woman. And we've literally just seen this happening to Imane Khelif and Lin Yu-ting. A second myth is that trans athletes' physiological characteristics provide an unfair advantage over cis athletes. This too is false. As well as ignoring the research findings that we've already gone over in this video, it also ignores the discrimination and harassment that trans women face, with 22% being harassed so badly they need to leave school, and another 10% being kicked out of school. Athletic ability varies greatly, as it does between trans athletes as well, and there are many factors that contribute to somebody being good at their sport, including height, training time, form, money spent on their sport, access to training, treatment within that sport. But conversations around physiological variations being unfair only really come up in women's sports, specifically when it comes to trans women or cis women being accused of being trans women. A third myth is that sex is binary, apparent at birth, and always identifiable through biological characteristics. This is false. Trans women, intersex women, cisgender women are all women. A person's sex is made up of multiple biological factors, and they may not all align as typically male or typically female in any given person, including many women who are not trans can have hormone levels that are outside of the typical range that would be expected for someone of their assigned birth sex. Setting arbitrary rules and exclusions in an attempt to remove trans women from women's sports will also negatively impact cis women, seeing as not everybody fits into this neat little binary box of sex and physical characteristics. A prime example of this is rules around testosterone levels, which led to the banning of cis women who had naturally high testosterone. Another example is chromosomes, which are not the only things that denote sex. Typically, what we see is that cis men have XY chromosomes and cis women have XX chromosomes. But there are a huge number of factors that could impact this without you even knowing. And you might never know what your chromosomes are unless you get a DNA analysis. For example, some men may have an extra X or an extra Y chromosome. An estimated 1 in 500 men have this, where fewer than 25% of them are aware. Similarly, around 1 in 1,000 cis women will have chromosomes different to the typically expected XX, and that's only for one format of variants. Does that mean that if you're a cis person watching this video and you've never had your DNA tested or thought about having your DNA tested or thought about what chromosomes you might have because you've just assumed, but you just happen to be that 1 in 500 or that 1 in 1,000 that has different chromosomes that would typically be expected? Does that mean you could no longer refer to yourself as the gender you know yourself to be? That would be silly, right? Another myth is that trans athletes need separate teams. This too is false. Trans people have just as much right to play sport as anybody else. And just the mere fact that there is so much pushback against trans people playing sport and there are so many exclusions highlight the disadvantage that they are at. And that's just one part of it. Trans athletes have been able to compete at all different levels of sport within the category of the gender they identify as for a really long time. And this has been happening without disruption to women's sports. The transphobes will be shocked. It's only becoming an issue now because transphobia is so loud and there's become some culture war about it and trans people are being used as political pawns. But segregation is never the route to take in these situations. And historical segregations are always seen as being on the wrong side of history. Trans women have been able to compete in the women's categories at the Olympic Games since the 2004 Athens Games. And in the past 2 decades, no domination of women's sports has occurred. And a decade ago, the inclusion rules around trans athletes were relaxed. Still no domination. It wasn't until Tokyo 2020 that we saw the first openly trans athlete competing. Hardly the domination that the transphobic fearmongers would have you believe. It's almost as if trans women competing in the women's category of sport isn't a threat. So even though we've seen the evidence that trans women are not and have not been dominating women's sports, the trans women who have undergone transition are not at a biomedical advantage over cis women, and there's this huge level of outcry even at the possibility of a trans woman competing at the Olympics. There aren't even any trans women at the Olympics this year. Because of the ability of separate international sports federations being able to set their own rules, many have done so at the expense of trans women's inclusion. Trans people have become pawns in a conservative movement, and their exclusions are not based on facts, science, or fairness, but instead bigotry, fear, and misogyny. At least 10 Olympic sports have restricted the inclusion of trans women. Some sports issued near blanket bans on trans women competing, and others issued bans on trans women who had not transitioned prior to starting puberty. As in, banning trans women who hadn't been able to take puberty blockers before starting puberty. The very medication and healthcare avenue that has currently been removed for trans kids in the UK, and that many other places are removing, restricted, or simply did not have accessible in the first place to trans kids. In essence, putting this kind of restriction on trans women competing is another blanket ban, and there's likely going to be a whole cohort of trans adults who were denied the necessary healthcare as children that would have made them eligible to compete. Transphobes trying to frame trans women's inclusion as unfair to cis women are coming from the deepest pit of irony, both ignoring all of the factors that genuinely impact fairness in sports for women and ignoring the science and the facts around trans women's inclusion in women's sports. And despite getting their way for the 2024 Olympic Games, they've still managed to find something to get mad at trans people about. You know what true feminists should be trying to change about women's sports though? The huge lack of fairness that has nothing anything to do with trans people. As mentioned earlier, there are a huge number of factors that lead to a lack of fairness and inclusion for women within sport, and that's all women. When have you ever heard any of the people currently shouting about Imane Khelif say anything about things like harassment towards women within sport, reduced funding compared to men's sports, lack of prioritization in facility access, the culture of sport being male dominated, sport being viewed as inherently unfeminine, and there being a lot of assumptions that women who play sport are not straight? And generally, representation for women within sport is massively lacking compared to men. Bigots don't address these very real issues because actually making sport more fair for women isn't their goal. Transphobia is. There are also people with literal distinct physiological advantages in their sport, yet the target for exclusions remain trans people. Not to say that I think anyone should be excluded, it's just to show that every avenue of reasoning, those wanting to exclude trans people are fully reliant on transphobia. They show no interest in any real area of inclusion and fairness within sport. An element of genetic profile plays a role in elite athletes' capabilities, but this needs to be combined with optimal training environments. Michael Phelps, for example, a white, straight, cisgender man, and also the most decorated Olympian of all time, has well-documented advantages to do with his arm span, body proportion, lung capacity, hyperflexible joints, and feet that are more akin to fins than the average person. But is he told that he can't swim because of these very real biological advantages? Ones that are distinctly identifiable as helping him within his sport over and above his competitors? No. In fact, he's celebrated for it. As well as the lack of fairness in access to sport and treatment within sporting environments, women's bodies are also subjected to unfair scrutiny. And the present vitriol against Imane Khelif has highlighted this yet again. And remember, this is to a cis person, not trans people. The cis people that these so-called feminists claim they're trying to protect are actually being reduced down to their body parts and their physical appearance. Something feminism has fought against since its creation. Questions over women's eligibility and woman's status have been questioned and at times tested ever since women were first included in the Olympics. Women who have performed particularly well, or have been seen as particularly strong, particularly fast, masculine, or just really good at their sport, have oftentimes been questioned, scrutinized, and sometimes tested to see if they are really women. Katie Ledecky, who has won the most gold medals for any woman swimmer in history, has been called a man because of her success. Very different treatment to Michael Phelps. At the level of sports in the Olympics, all athletes are at the top of their sport, and whilst it takes an extreme level of hard work and dedication, it does take some form of biological superiority, especially for the record setters. Yet it only seems to be the women athletes who face accusations and scrutiny when they are the best of the best, not the men. A lot of these judgments, including most recently Imane Khelif and Lin Yu-ting, highlight the still very prevalent issue of not only misogyny, but also racism within sports and society. Tennis player Serena Williams is a woman who has frequently been called a man throughout her career. Women of colour are disproportionately targeted with questions over their gender, and are often the focus of the type of witch hunt that we're seeing Imane go through right now. Again, it's not feminism, it's misogyny, going hand in hand with transphobia, going hand in hand with racism. Instead of judging and overanalyzing women's capabilities and their bodies, maybe we should all just celebrate them and their successes. The very loud current issue of transphobia within sports speaks to the still prevalent issue of misogyny and racism within sport. It's all connected. The very people who are being transphobic to trans athletes or any athletes they deem to be trans, and doing so in the name of feminism and protecting women, are feeding directly into the misogyny that is the actual detriment to women in sport and women generally within society. And where does this lead? It leads to all women, including cisgender women, being unfairly or even strategically targeted just because they are good. In the 60s, women athletes had to prove their sex by showing their genitalia to sporting officials. It became known as the nude parade and was ended in the late 60s. How disgusting is all of that? This is where transphobia gets us. It just brings us back round to misogyny and mistreating all women. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a politician, said it best. We're talking about opening up all women and girls to genital exams when they're underage, potentially just because someone can point and say, I don't think you're a girl. Where states are criminalizing access to abortion and wanting nothing more than data on women to figure out when, who's getting a menstrual cycle and who doesn't have one, and we're supposed to believe this is going to make us better and safer. And in this situation with the Olympics, Kremlin has literally suggested that doctors should do these tests to the two boxers. And what all this shows is a huge double standard. Because when there are actual threats to women, the same people who scream all that transphobia are not there to support women women in sports at that time. They're not there to call out the actual dangers and the actual problems. The most prime example related to this specific Olympics is the fact that there's a cisgender man competing in the games who is a convicted. He horrifically a 12-year-old girl on 3 accounts. Once again, he has been convicted, yet he is still competing in the Olympic Games. So if you want to talk about competitors who are a danger, there you have one. There have obviously been people calling out his inclusion, but there's not been the same social media storm about it that there has been about Imane Khelif. Why is it that there can be a convicted the Olympic Games, but yet the biggest problem and threat, according to Twitter trolls, is trans people? And even more ridiculously, any woman they deem to be trans. Further evidence that their attempts to be feminists only matter when it aligns with their transphobic views. To summarize, and I know it's been a long video, thank you for sticking with it, but a lot of this narrative has really highlighted the speed at which some people want to villainize anyone they suspect of being trans, and pile on anyone they suspect of being trans on social media without a thought for the individual involved. The kind of treatment that these athletes have been subjected to is not justified, regardless of their gender identity, regardless of whether they are trans or not, regardless of the results of those tests. This is not okay. It's also so bizarre how ready all those claiming to want to protect women are assuming that women who are doing well in their sports must actually be biologically male. Women's bodies have been unfairly scrutinized forever, including in sport. And this debate over trans inclusion within sport is, yes, transphobia, but also just another way that all women and their bodies are being unfairly scrutinized and judged, particularly women of color. Transphobes who claim to want to protect women are doing the exact opposite. Being transphobic does not protect women. Excluding trans women does not protect anyone. Putting efforts into fighting misogyny and racism instead of being transphobic would be the best way that these people could actually protect all women. And that's it. That's the video. I feel like new stuff is coming out about this quite often, so this is up to date as of the morning of the 6th of August. Let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for watching this video. Think about giving a thumbs up and subscribing if you want to, but no pressure, and I will see you next time. Much love. Bye.